Good morning, everybody. Just waiting a few minutes to let all the participants in. We do have 100 registered. So far, we've got 37 who have arrived on the chat. So I'd like to give it a few more minutes to allow everybody to join, and then we'll get started. Good morning to all those that have just joined. I make it bang on 10 o'clock. I'm just going to allow a few more minutes as we do have 100 participants registered, 47 in attendance at the moment. So just want to wait a couple more minutes to allow any last minute attendees, and then we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. We'll get started as we've only got an hour allocated to this webinar this morning. Just so that I know you can all hear and see me okay, can you use the raise hand function, just so I know you're all there and everything's okay? Wonderful, thank you. Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much. It's just good to know that you're all there, because it's very strange doing webinars, talking to lots of people when you can't actually see or hear them. Just a couple of little bits of housekeeping. If you can lower your hands again, that'd be excellent. Thank you. For those that may not have used Zoom webinar before, there are a couple of functions on here that you can use. There's the chat function, and there's also the Q&A box. Now, we did ask participants for some any questions they had prior to starting this event. So we do have a couple of forward questions, but if there's questions that you think of that come up during the presentation while our panelists are speaking, then please do pop them in the Q&A. Q&A is better, ideally, but if you want to use the chat, that's absolutely fine as well. I'll keep an eye on both. So I think that's all the housekeeping. Yep. So the panelists that we have on the call today are David Corlett. Go to my next slide, hopefully. Hang on a minute, bear with me. Next slide, yes. So today we have David Corlett, who is the head of European and Trade Policy team at the Cabinet Office. We have Phil Morris, who's tax director at PwC, and we also have Stephen Beavers, senior manager for international trade at the Department for Enterprise. So we pulled together a little panel here of people that hopefully can shed a bit more light on the post-exit. David will give a general update and sort of keep us up to speed on where we're up to now. We've invited Phil Morris from PwC, and my thanks go to Phil for offering to do this for us. Just to give a sort of tax and customs focus for you all, and Stephen will jump in at the end and talk a bit more about rules of origin. Now, one thing I would like to say is that all of us, all of the panel, and myself included, don't pretend to know all the answers at the moment. We're all still working our way through this, the post-exit. So please bear with us, especially the panel. They'll do their best to answer your questions as best they can, but we may get to a point where not all questions can be answered, but I will be monitoring the questions, keeping track of them, and we'll come back to any questions that we can't answer today. The panel will take away and endeavour to answer. Really, what we're hoping today actually is that this webinar will draw out more questions, things that people, businesses here are wanting to know the answers to, that perhaps David and Stephen could go away and try and find those answers. So without further ado, I'm just going to do a little bit of Zoom jiggery, hopefully, and bear with me while I switch presentations over to here. Okay, and I will be bringing David in 2 minutes. Okay, so what we're going to do first of all is hand over to David, who will give you a general update on where we are up to. So I'm just going to ask them to bring their video in and unmute. If we just wait a couple of minutes, that should happen.
Okay. It's not my video.
We are.
Okay. Are we on?
You are on,
No,
yes.
thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, as Beck says, I'm David Corlett. I'm head of the Isle of Man Government's European and Trade Policy team, formerly known as the Brexit team in the Cabinet Office. I think we're all familiar with how we've got to where we are now, but I just wanted to run through very quickly the background, the overview of the negotiations first. So you'll recall that the referendum took place in June of 2016. It seems a long time ago. They took a while to actually begin talking formally when what was known as Article 50 was triggered on the 29th of March in 2017. And that signalled the beginning of the formal withdrawal and negotiation process. Now, as you'll recall, there was a great deal of political upheaval, if we can call it that, which took place during that initial phase of negotiations. Theresa May's vision, if you call it that, for her future relationship with the EU was somewhat different from some of the more hardline Brexiters within her government. And she failed to secure agreement to the withdrawal agreement that she'd negotiated. Thus, there was a change in government. Boris Johnson came to lead the party and the country. And his take on it was slightly more, should we say, hardline. It was more of a hard Brexit flavour to that government. So they needed to do two things during the initial phase of negotiations. That was set out the terms on which the UK would leave, and also set out the roadmap for the future relationship. Those two things had to be settled before they could actually formally leave. Now, that took until the 31st of March 2020, sorry, the 31st of January 2020, when the withdrawal agreement was signed and the political declaration attached to it set out what the new relationship would contain. So essentially, the negotiation of the UK-EU new relationship has taken place all during 2020 and primarily, mostly during lockdown, which came with its own challenges. So the UK set its own objectives for what it wanted to achieve in January, February of last year. It created a kind of Frankenstein's monster, if you like, of all a patchwork of various chapters and provisions from other FTAs which the EU had with other countries. That includes Canada, Japan, Vietnam, Singapore, etc. It created what it loosely called a best-in-class model of a free trade agreement. Now, that was what the UK intended to achieve. If we look then at what the Isle of Man wanted to get out of the arrangement, of course, we were always going to be limited by what the UK was seeking for itself. So we were able to view what the UK put forward in its draft agreement to the EU and determine what elements of that agreement we would like to participate in, what we could live with. And because the UK, the new UK government was pursuing a relatively hard Brexit, the content of the agreement was not as ambitious as it had been for the Theresa May government, and so it was something that we could probably, having viewed all of the text, sign up to. However, on first contact with the EU, the UK negotiating on our behalf, the EU said to the UK, in respect of the Crown dependencies and indeed in respect of the UK itself, that no party should benefit from having left the EU. That meant, in effect, that we were only ever going to be covered for goods. And in return from the Crown dependencies, the EU wanted to retain some measure of access to our territorial waters for fisheries. So that was what played out during the following months. And of course, it all got fairly difficult at times. We were negotiating not directly with the EU, but the UK was negotiating on our behalf. We had very good access to Cabinet Office in the UK, to Task Force Europe, which was based in Number 10. And essentially, the Isle of Man and the other Crown dependencies were able to put forward drafts of text through the UK that would eventually be adopted in the agreement itself. So looking at the application of the agreement to the Crown dependencies, and indeed to the Isle of Man, there are three places really that you would need to look to see how it applies to us. The first one is in Part 7, the final provisions, which set out the territorial scope of the agreement. It says, obviously it applies to the UK on the one hand, on the EU hand, and certain territories which are in customs union with the EU, say Monaco, for example. And on the UK side, it says that certain portions apply to the Isle of Man and the other Crown dependencies. It doesn't apply to the overseas territories, and it doesn't likewise apply to Gibraltar. That territorial scope provision refers us then to two other sections of the treaty, and they fall within Section 2, which deals with goods and fisheries, etc. The Isle of Man's coverage in respect of goods, you will find in Section 2 and Heading 6 on other provisions, which then defines which elements of the agreement apply to the Isle of Man. So those are the goods elements, essentially. And you will see in there that it details the chapters which apply to the Isle of Man and the other Crown dependencies. And they are those on national treatment and market access, on rules of origin, on sanitary and phytosanitary provisions, on technical barriers to trade, and on customs. And then there are also certain protocols and annexes attached to each of those chapters which would apply to us. So this is quite a straightforward provision. It says those parts of this agreement apply to the Isle of Man. There is also a provision in that section which relates to termination clauses, the manner in which either party can terminate the agreement on behalf of, in respect of the other. It's interesting to note that if the EU, for example, wanted to terminate the agreement in respect of the Isle of Man, it could do so without impacting the other Crown dependencies. There are far more detail around how it goes about that. And also, that section links to the fisheries provisions. So what was interesting during the course of the negotiations was that goods access for the Crown dependencies is very much linked to continuing access for fisheries. So the termination provisions between the fish part and the goods part are also linked. And then I'm not sure if many people on this call will be interested, but the fish provisions are set out in Articles 10 and 11 of the fisheries heading within the goods chapter. Essentially, it means what the provision means is that the Crown dependencies have agreed to retain access for EU vessels to their waters on the same basis that they might access now, which is very limited for the Isle of Man. Access to our waters is governed by, or was governed by, the London Fisheries Convention. It meant that there was certain access for vessels from Ireland, Belgium. Each of those had access to certain portions of our territorial sea between 6 and 12 miles from the coast. They were only able to fish for certain species, so not scallops, which is our main catch, if you like. And then the new thing that was introduced by the agreement was that in order to do so, they would need to obtain a license, which was to be issued by Isle of Man Fisheries Authority for the first time. And in order to get that license, an applicant would have to prove that they had a substantive track record, that is, that they'd actually fished in our waters before. So this was a reflection of the fact that the Crown dependencies were willing to acknowledge that some fishermen do access our waters, but not the theoretical maximum which might have had the right of access rather than the actual practical access. So as I mentioned, I think those three parts of the agreement are where you would want to look to see how it applies to the Isle of Man. The section on territorial scope in part 7, and then the two elements of part 2, which deal with both goods and fish. And then, of course, there are the individual chapters within the goods title. So I think that's probably enough from me to give a general overview on the negotiation process and coverage. And I'd hand over to Bill to cover customs and tax matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that introduction, general overview. So what we'll do now is we'll bring Phil Morris in. Hopefully he will appear like magic. Just bear with me. Phil. Okay, here we go. I'm just bringing him over. Here he comes. Hi, Phil.
Hiya.
Excellent. You're all good.
Good. Well, hopefully you can see my screen.
Yeah, we can indeed.
Good. That's a good start. Yeah, thanks very much, David and Bex. Yeah, just really following on from what David had said there, what I'm primarily going to cover is how the new relationship impacts our trading relationship, primarily in goods. So I am primarily going to focus on goods because that's really the main interaction that the Isle of Man has with the EU and the implications. It's not to say that there aren't some things to do with businesses that primarily focus on services, but I think that's a lot less of an issue, but I will touch on some of the issues associated with this. So I guess to set the scene, so where are we with this? As David alluded to, we left the single market. So the Isle of Man and the UK left the EU on the 31st of December 2021. And the Isle of Man therefore formally left the EU single market and the customs union. But I guess it's important to restate that the Isle of Man still retains its customs union and trading relationship with the UK, so that hasn't been affected by this. And this was all a result of the agreement with the EU, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which really sets the basis for the trading relationship between the UK and the EU going forward. And implicitly, that also therefore impacts the Isle of Man. I mean, effectively, what the TCA did was set out the post-Brexit commercial and regulatory arrangement. So it set up the framework for what the trading relationship is going to look like going forward. And I guess the main impact for the Isle of Man and the headline news was the potential tariff and quota-free movement of goods between the UK, Isle of Man, and the rest of the EU. So on the face of it, that's a very good thing. It to some extent maintains the status quo we previously had, that there'll be movement of goods, hopefully without the imposition of tariffs, which are customs duties, import taxes, etc. But there is a slight caveat to that, which I'll come on to, and I think Stephen will explain later, that I use the word potential tariff and quota-free movement of goods because, as ever, there are conditions attached to it. But if those conditions are met, then we do have this, hopefully there's less frictions to trade, but there will still be certain limitations in terms of increased administration and increased regulatory and compliance checks. So, there still isn't the free movement of goods, which is what we previously would have had with the EU, but it has removed the kind of, I guess, the worst case scenario of more formal trade barriers. And I guess that brings to the last point here really is, as a result of all of this, effectively what we've now got between what I say is GB and the EU is a hard border, effectively a customs border. As people may be aware, there are special arrangements to do with Northern Ireland contained within the Northern Ireland Protocol. So there are a few additional things to consider where there's trade involving Northern Ireland or goods transiting through Northern Ireland. So there are specific rules that apply there, which makes the situation slightly more complex there. So going back to the point I said about potential tariff and quota-free movement of goods, the point out there is on the right-hand side, the devil really is in the detail. If people aren't aware of what the rules of origin or haven't heard of them, I think they'll soon be getting very familiar with this term, because really to benefit from this tariff and quota-free movement of goods, it all depends on these rules of origin, which are essentially, where do the goods come from? Do they meet certain tests and criteria to demonstrate they either have UK or EU origin? And if they do, then we can benefit from the tariff and quota-free travel. However, if between the Isle of Man and the EU, there is a lot more paperwork, there's a lot more administration, there's a lot more formalities to deal with. So these are kind of the non-customs issues, but really kind of have added an additional layer of complexity to the matter. So that kind of sets the framework for where we're up to at the moment in terms of our trading relationship with the EU going forward. what we move on to now is really
Phil, I'm very sorry to interrupt. Could you just go into presentation mode? It'll make the slides a little bit larger for everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Just bear with me. Is that better?
Perfect, thank you.
Apologies for that. Okay, so moving on then, we're on to the practical considerations. Now, these are steps that traders may have already taken in advance of 31 December to try and, you know, when we didn't have any certainty, but to try and be in best position to address this. But I still think these are very valid points now. And now we have a bit more certainty about what the position looks like. There are certain other things that we can add on to this to try and, I guess, give traders, to put them in the best position possible to be able to deal with this. And it is going to be problematic, and we are all learning as we go along, but hopefully it will become more business as usual as all of these things bed in. So really kind of going back to some of the original steps that traders should be taking if they haven't already. The first is making sure you have a GB EORI. An EORI is effectively it's a trading registration number that helps with import and export matters and will be used on a lot of customs declarations and other documentation to help facilitate the movement of goods. So this is applied for through customs and obtained from HMRC. But again, you know, making sure you've got an EORI. And again, this applies whether you're an occasional trader or a more frequent trader. You will need one of these to help with the movement of goods. The second step is, are you an authorized economic operator? There are a few of these on the Isle of Man, and effectively this is a trusted trader status. It means that you are almost best in class in terms of international trade. You've got high standards, you've got good administration, you've got good compliance. But some of the benefits of having this accreditation means that hopefully when you're transiting goods or you're dealing with a lot of compliance and paperwork, but because you've got this accreditation, it means hopefully that things happen more quickly, more seamlessly. It can also have some benefits in terms of if financial guarantees are needed, it can mean that they're either reduced or not required. It's not necessarily one for everyone. It's probably for much more frequent and larger volume traders, but it is a good accreditation to have to make that process more slick and quick. For people that are new to the importation and exportation process, they'll be getting very familiar with customs declarations. Now, this is the paperwork that goes with transiting goods. And really the point here is that there's a lot of information needed. People don't necessarily have the skills and knowledge to complete these. So working out how you're going to do these, or more to the point, who you're going to get to help with these customs declarations. That may be a freight forwarder, an import agent, or someone similar, people that have the expertise to deal with. And yes, there can be a cost attached to this, but really getting it right means that hopefully you get goods through borders much more quickly rather than it being held up because a certain bit of information isn't there or you don't have a piece of evidence to support something. So deciding how and who is going to help with your customs declarations is a key point. Are your imported goods eligible for stage controls? What this basically means is for the first 6 months of this year, again, it applies to certain goods and it applies to certain traders, but the level of detail and the information provided on import declarations can either be reduced or indeed, in certain circumstances, it's possible that you can make these import declarations at a later date. Again, really simplifying the process in the first 6 months and speeding up the processing of goods. So again, it depends what you're doing and what your position is. But if you can potentially benefit from these, it can cut down the paperwork needed at this point in time. The next point is consider the origin of your goods. This goes back to the point about benefiting from tariff and quota-free trade. And it really comes down to this point about the origin of your goods. Where are they from? And there are a very specific set of rules, the rules of origin that govern this. And these are determined based on the free trade agreements. And I think Stephen's going to touch on that a bit later on, so I won't go into too much detail. But again, it's a critical point to be aware of. Check the UK's tariff tables. What this is all around the classification of goods, and they will be given a 10-digit number. And the importance of this and getting classification right is where tariffs, import taxes do apply. This essentially tells you what that potential tariff rate may be, whether you can benefit from any preferential terms. And again, the devil can be in the detail, that you may have a product that it may potentially have 2 different classifications, which could give different results in terms of the rate of duty that may apply. So getting it right means that you could potentially benefit from paying a lower rate of duty, or indeed hopefully no rate of duty at all. So getting that process right is key. But again, it's a complicated process, so it may be that you need the assistance of a specialist to help with that. The next point is deciding how you're going to account for import VAT. Traditionally, import VAT has been paid at the time of importation. So when the goods come into the port or the airport, at that point, import VAT is due and payable, subject to any deferment regimes. But what's available now is the option for what's called postponed VAT accounting, effectively a deferment of the requirement to account for the VAT. So rather than paying upfront at the point of importation, there's the option now to account for the VAT on the VAT return. And those familiar with the concepts of things like the reverse charge mechanism for services or acquisition VAT, which used to apply for EU movement of goods, it's a similar concept where effectively you deal with the VAT accounting on the VAT return, and that can potentially have cash flow benefits rather than having to pay VAT at the point of import. So that's something worth considering. As mentioned in the previous slide, there are some special arrangements for Northern Ireland. It's probably too much detail to go into today, but if you're moving your own goods into Northern Ireland, or goods are transiting through Northern Ireland, either into the rest of Great Britain or through to the Republic of Ireland, there are some very specific rules, both VAT and customs, around how you deal with those obligations, because essentially Northern Ireland maintains this quasi-EU VAT status, whilst also remaining part of the UK VAT and customs union. So it kind of straddles both aspects, and there are some quite specific rules governing trade involving Northern Ireland. So again, if that impacts you, there's information available either through Isle of Man Customs or HMRC website. So it's just things to be aware of if that impacts you. Do you potentially need to consider EU VAT registration? So an example could be if you hold a stock of goods in an EU country, for example, and you're making sales into the local market, it's possible that you may need a local VAT registration in that country to account for the VAT due on those local sales. And likewise for services or certain types of services, and I'm primarily thinking of what's called electronically supplied services or telecoms or digital type services, it may be that you have to VAT register in one jurisdiction in something called the mini one-stop shop, the MOS VAT regime, which is a scheme that allows for accounting for VAT throughout the EU, but through a central VAT registration. So, for specific types of businesses that are in that field, they may need to consider whether they have an obligation under this or not. It sounds like a lot of this may have added additional complexity. However, there are certain areas where potentially Brexit has had some positive impacts. And the last point here is around businesses that are primarily in the financial services or the insurance sector and they have customers that may be located in the EU and non-EU. One of the potential benefits that Brexit has brought around here is that where they have EU located customers, for these types of businesses where they may have limited VAT recovery, there may be additional scope to increase their VAT recovery position where they have quite a heavy presence in the EU. So there may be some scope for them to revisit their VAT recovery position and potentially, hopefully, get some additional VAT recovery, which will benefit the overall business. So those are just some practical considerations in terms of how businesses may want to think about how they tackle and get to grips. As I said at the outset, this is new for a lot of people. It's evolving, so there will be challenges along the way. But as we get more used to what the relationship's like and what's required, hopefully things will settle down, and hopefully tackling some of these points will help smooth the process. So that's my session, Beck. So if I hand over to Stephen, who's going to talk about the rules of origin in a bit more detail.
Thank you so much, Phil. Just bear with me while I do a bit more jiggering around with the participants, and I'll bring Stephen and back him.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Bex. Can everybody hear?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Stephen.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I want to spend, if I may, 5 or 10 minutes talking about the rules of origin in particular, as they are vitally important. Clearly, when the UK negotiated the TCA and, of course, the Isle of Man's involvement in this, a lot of people presumed that the real benefit was going to be, tariff-free, zero tariff trade. And of course, that is one of the key benefits of free trade agreements. Equally, that isn't automatic, and the rules of origin, therefore, are vitally important to understand and be able to apply in order for you, in particular, as movers of goods, to be able to get the benefit of these free or reduced tariffs. So hence, I'm going to spend a few minutes on this. So what are rules of origin? They're a common feature of free trade agreements across the world. And of course, the UK-EU clearly is hugely important in getting this right, because people wanted to enjoy this real benefit of trade as free as possible with no tariffs. So clearly it's very important to exporters and importers on both sides of the channel in terms of obtaining these tariffs, these zero preferential tariffs, as they're called. And so you need to understand these rules. Now, fortunately, the TCA, which runs to 1,246 pages, only has 15 pages that covers rules of origin. So the actual law is only covered in 15 pages. And then there are annexes consisting of about another 70 pages that you can refer to that classify specific goods and specific rule treatments that we can look at to get more specific details. So they're easily found in the agreement, and there are very new terms to those who aren't familiar with them that you need to become familiar with. Of course, those who trade with the rest of the world may well understand some of these rules already in terms of the principles as they apply. So let's have a quick look at some of the terms that you need to be familiar with. Originating, so this is where the goods are coming from Europe and may or may not be included. It also determines if they're coming from the rest of the world as to whether or not they're included. There's also terms like cumulation, whereby, and it gets even more complex, it talks about bilateral and diagonal cumulation, and cumulation refers to how the agreement governs the mixing of materials that go into goods and how they're treated both in the EU and the UK. Most importantly, there has to be sufficient production as an element of the tests for getting the tariff free, and I'll come back to that with an example. And there are references to suppliers' declarations and so forth that are equally important in order that you can claim all of this. But absolutely fundamentally, the key questions you need to be looking at as importers or exporters are where are the materials originating, what qualifies for this origination test, and what evidence is required, what evidence do you need to gather and prove in order to claim or enable your importer who's buying from you to get a tariff-free regime. There are requirements for UK exports to the EU that clearly you'd be interested in as an exporter from the Isle of Man. And the starting point really is understanding the classification of your goods in the harmonized system, the classification codes for each item, which typically the first six digits are important. The first 2 digits refer to a chapter of the classification of the goods, so it might well be, for argument's sake, motor vehicles. The second 2 heads refer to more detail, which you can then enables you to properly classify your goods, and then there are subheadings. And it's important to know how that works, because you need to cross-reference these rules in some cases, or these codes actually, to the annexes attached to the trade agreement to understand if in fact your goods qualify for zero tariff. And also there may be one or more alternative ways of qualifying that you can look at under that classification. So it may be by weight, or it may be by tolerance, or it may be by other means. So what's important though is to note there are 4 types of rules. Some goods are automatically deemed to be wholly obtained. So for example, fairly obvious things are animals and minerals. So if the Isle of Man is growing animals or extracting minerals, so there's processing involved, there's the raising of the animals, they're wholly classified and generally speaking would obtain the zero tariff treatment on export into the EU. Then there are what's called change in tariff rules. So this is whereby the 2 items that you import, say for argument's sake in material sense, that you then transform into another item for sale into the EU, for argument's sake, results in a change in tariff code. So that's where you have to start thinking about classifying the goods to these rules. There's also a value add rule. So this also takes account of how much you increase the price over the material costs versus your ex-works price. And there's also what's called exact specific rules. Probably doesn't really apply much in the Isle of Man, because that talks about things like chemical processes where there's a sort of standard recognition of mixing 2 chemicals to produce another chemical. So probably what's most important to most manufacturers in the Isle of Man could well be the value add rule and change of tariff rules. But there's other things that need to be demonstrated as well. So whatever you end up with in terms of what you think is the correct rule, you also need to be able to evidence for customs purposes, either by self-declaration, or the importer needs to have sufficient knowledge of what he's buying from you in order that this zero tariff can be obtained. So clearly, in order to evidence this, you have to know the source of your materials, whether they are themselves originating and whether they meet the tests of the various rules. So it does get quite complicated. I'll come to an example in a moment. And in reverse, clearly, if you are buying goods from the EU that have been made or whatever in the EU, there is almost a reverse application of the rules. So the person who is making the goods in the EU or selling them to you also needs to tick all of these boxes. And especially then if you're taking these goods and reprocessing them and then sending them back to the EU, there's even further checks. Most people who do already ship, for example, to rest of the world like China or America will know that the Chamber of Commerce also issues certificates of origin, and they may well be familiar with those. The UK-EU treaty, unfortunately, is not explicit in terms of how that would work. It's actually silent on the use of chamber certificates, and that's because you can self-declare this on commercial documents. So in the rules of origin, in the annexes, there are actually self-declaration formats You don't actually use a form. You can, as long as you follow the wording, you can put it on your invoice or another commercial document. But there's one for short-term declarations like one-off sales to Europe, and there's one for longer term where your customer shipments are regular, which can last up to 12 months and exceptionally up to 24 months under certain circumstances. So you need to be absolutely clear that if you are the ones that are making the declaration, or your customer requires you to make that declaration, certainly they're going to want evidence of your originating product that they comply, then you have to put that format onto some of your commercial document to either evidence that, or you're going to have to satisfy the importer, or the importer needs to have sufficient knowledge that he can make that declaration. So there are two ways of doing this. So let's take an example. If in the EU, somebody made a flat pack table, a furniture table out of wood, the wood's originating in Europe, the machining is done in Europe, it's all packaged up, it's sold to the UK, that should qualify for the zero tariff as it comes into the UK. However, if you then decide, oh, okay, I'm going to do something with this, I'm going to varnish it, I'm going to build it, I'm going to send it back to the EU as a finished item, there are tests of what's called sufficient production, and there's a list of what, in fact, in the annexes to this chapter as to what is sufficient production. What I've just described is not sufficient production. Interestingly, if you were to use British wood for making table legs, and you assembled those into the item and maybe did some varnishing and finishing and other value add activity, then you could ship it to the EU and it would be tariff free as it goes into the EU. So those are the kind of rules and tests and things that you've got to watch for. Then if you were to take another example, stay with the table, say that a lot of the materials for the table that was made in Europe as a flat pack came from China. Now, that would mean that the EU, unless it was able to, under an agreement, which there isn't one with China, but depending on the proportion of what's the mixes and the cumulative rules that the EU has to meet, it may or may not, according to the test, allow that to be counted depending on the percentage proportion, and it's specific to each goods and there are tolerances and so on, for that to be classed as originating in Europe or not. Now, if it's originating in Europe and that's allowed, then you can still bring it into the UK tariff free. However, if it's not originating, then somebody's going to be paying some duty on part of that. So this is where you need to be clear. Now, one thing that's interesting and important is that, generally speaking, where something's classed as originating in the EU, when you bring it into the UK, that doesn't, you can count that as originating as part of your add value production materials in the UK, if you understand me. So it's only, for example, if you, as a manufacturer here, directly brought materials from China and then mixed them with stuff from the UK and the EU, that you might be compromising in that scenario your originating qualifying materials. But what you have to do, as I say, is go to these rules, classify by HS code, cross-refer to the chapter here and its annexes, and there may even be one or more tests. It may be by weight. It might say, you have the option of allowing originating material by weight or percentage, or by other means, and you may have a choice that's more advantageous. In some scenarios, there might be tariffs to pay on that non-originating element, or the whole thing might be disallowed. You really just need to look at the rules. So very important, very complex, I'm afraid, but you do need to be familiar with them if you're to ensure that what you're making here, or what you're buying and reprocessing here in goods terms, qualifies under these rules. So I'm going to stop there, I think, because it's a complex area, but a very important one.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm just going to bring Phil back in so that we can do some Q&A for the last 10 minutes. So just bear with me. I'm just going to stop screen sharing. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you very much, all three of you. I've got a couple, there's a question on the Q&A that I'll put to you, and I have a couple of advanced questions as well. So we'll start with them, and then if anyone else has any other questions, please pop them in the Q&A now. So one of the first questions we had through was, I'll let you raise your hand who wants to answer this, by the way. Will there be a requirement for Isle of Man /UK businesses that have a CE mark to now also apply for a CA mark? Who's going to answer that?
We certainly know, I think, that it's permissible for the time being, but I think the UK does plan to introduce a CA mark in the future. I don't know if they're allowing 12 months on that, actually, before that's introduced. Maybe Phil knows the answer to that. That's my understanding, but you know, they do plan to have their own marking for this, but it's not necessarily going to be brought in straight away. There is the option, I think, for certain goods to adopt it. There are exemptions, though, I think, possibly in the medical field as well. But,
Excellent.
you know, it's...
Thank you, Stephen. You've just frozen, actually, so I'm not sure. Phil, you're still there, aren't you? Stephen's frozen. Stephen, Phil, can you just check you're not muted? I think we've lost. Oh, there.
Seems to have frozen there. Are we?
Whether someone's frozen for me or everybody else, you're back. Right. Another question. Can you explain bilateral accumulation and how EU originated goods count as UK originated goods under the rules of origin for the UK/EU free trade agreement?
So you're breaking up there, Bex, but I think the question was, how do we count bilateral accumulated goods? Yes, okay. So bilateral refers to two countries coming together. Certainly everything that's classified according to the tests and the rules as being originating in Europe, and that might also include things brought in from other countries, provided that when it comes out of Europe, they're originating when they're brought into the UK and then put into something else. As long as they are originating when they come out, then they can be originating when they're resold into Europe. Yeah. But of course, the producer of those goods and his materials, when he's exporting or before he exports in the EU, has to make sure he meets all the tests of the rules at that point for that to happen. But the agreement allows for this to happen, that a certain percentage or certain elements of materials from other countries can be counted. But you need to be sure that, and this is where actually what's called suppliers declarations and so on. So if you, for example, as a manufacturer in the Isle of Man, need to prove to your customer in Europe that you know, you really need to understand and get some evidence even for yourself to back up your own declaration as to where your materials come from and what proportions by value or weight, etc. You know, you've got in that, so that you can then evidence that to customs if required later on to ensure that the claim is for zero is valid.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. How will any dispute resolution work between the Isle of Man, UK and EU?
If I can pick up on that point, I think they're still working through. I mean, obviously, one of the key issues was the UK insisting that the European Court of Justice wouldn't still be involved in the decision making. So I think they've kind of removed that from it. My understanding is they're going to have a series of bodies that are going to be set up across a range of areas, which are going to have representatives from both the UK and the EU, and those bodies will have the dispute resolution and the decision making in their particular area. So, for instance, I believe they're going to be setting one up that will cover trade matters, and again, you know, anything within their jurisdiction and their remit, they'll decide between them. I guess, again, this is probably one of the areas where we know the theory, practically how it's going to work and what kind of decision making and how it will evolve, we'll see further down the line. So there are mechanisms in place, but effectively my understanding is it's kind of cooperative and collaboration between the UK and the EU through various designated bodies.
That's right. I'd just add to that of course the UK is the party to the agreement, so it will represent the Isle of Man where we're engaged on each of those specialised committees or consultative bodies or what have you. And then between ourselves and the UK, we're looking to put in place a dispute resolution mechanism, which is merely an intergovernmental structure which reflects our constitutional relationship with the UK. Effectively, like any international agreement, the UK is responsible for and answerable for the Isle of Man to the other international partner. And then we, for want of a better phrase, argue it out between ourselves as to what's actually happening and whether we are or we aren't meeting our obligations. It's very similar to how things work or did work with the EU. So we saw, for example, there was a complaint about application of VAT in respect of private aircraft in the Isle of Man. That complaint or investigation was launched by the Commission, and it was HMRC in the UK which was responsible for answering to the Commission. However, they worked very closely with Isle of Man customs officials in order to answer that query. It's the same with other questions of EU law. So it's not going to be a million miles away from how it worked before. But as Phil says, this is all going to have to be sorted out as the relationship develops in the coming months and years.
Thank you very much, David and Phil, for that. A question that we have on the Slido, under the new trade agreement post-Brexit, it will be required to report to declare VAT on import-exports through an entity based and settled within EU countries. Would there be a way to process that through an existing Isle of Man company registered or through another tiered vehicle?
I've got one for Phil.
Thank you. I think the position depends. I mean, you don't necessarily have to kind of set up a local entity in a particular EU country to deal with, customs and importation processes. It may be that you can use an import agent. It may be that you have to appoint someone more formal, like a fiscal representative, which is more enabled to act on your behalf. Now, before we had the single market, it was very common to kind of have import agents and fiscal representatives in individual EU countries to deal with these types of declarations. And certainly back then, the position very much varied depending on jurisdiction. And for non-EU traders trading into specific EU countries, depending on where they are, depended on what the requirement was. But generally speaking, you don't have to specifically have a local operation or a local entity to act as your presence in that particular country. You can appoint someone to act on your behalf, but the specific requirements and what they're required to do can vary by jurisdiction by jurisdiction. It can be that you just have someone to deal with your paperwork. It can be that you have to legally appoint someone to act on your behalf, and you then have issues of joint and several liability, for example. So I think it depends which jurisdictions you're looking at and what their specific local rules are.
Thank you very much, Phil, for that. That really clears that up, actually. Thank you. Another question, just before we finish off, I think another one's just come through, but I'll just go through this one first, which I can actually answer from a Chamber perspective. We're trying to work out how to classify origin with mixed products in one export shipment. In the case of one example, we have a box of mixed goods, for example, a mug from China and plates from Poland. One thing you do have to do is declare the origin for every single item. So if they were mixed, each item's origin needs to be proven or declared. That's certainly how we would, if we were to issue a certificate of origin, we would need to see proof of origin for each individual item. So hopefully that clears that up for you.
Yeah, if I may just add, Bex, I think there's a test for sets in the rules, and therefore if it's a set of items, it depends. What you've described, you're quite right, it probably would have to be independently because it wouldn't be a set. But if you were, if all the porcelain came from China and all branding came from Poland, and depending on how the value add was there, sufficient production, it might meet the test, it might not. But from what you've described, random items going into a shipment, if it's not a set, there's a set rules there to look at as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a question in from Marlon. Do you think that materials passport approaches could help with the rules of origin? I don't understand the question.
Sorry, do you mind repeating that one? I didn't.
Do you think that materials passport approaches could help with the rules of origin?
Materials passport approach. It doesn't refer to materials passport approach, but equally, if you're a manufacturer, you will want to know from your suppliers, you'll want to get suppliers' declarations to understand, and in effect that becomes your passport, because you will make a declaration as to where all these materials came from, and of course that relies then goes back to your suppliers as to what they can declare or demonstrate to you. Yeah.
Right, yeah, that makes sense, yeah. Right, okay, great timing, very impressed with this all. It's 10:59. So I haven't had any more questions through on the Q&A. Have you got any there, Stephen, that you want to answer that you received in advance that I haven't covered?
Yeah, I think this one might come through you actually, Bex. It was, I think it said, we currently offer large numbers of online training courses to the EU, to EU residents. What are the issues for us to consider under new arrangements? Well, as I understand it, that would be a digital service. And of course, the Isle of Man was a third country before this, so in theory, you can, as far as I'm aware, there's no changes for digital services. It may be on the VAT side, on the VAT.
Yeah, Stephen, if I can come in there, this kind of goes back to one of the points I made under practical considerations about considering whether you need to VAT register in a country or not. It very much depends on what you're supplying, the format of it, the content, etc. But for certain things that are supplied over the internet, electronically, digitally, or broadcast, there are a set of rules that mean that you have to potentially consider VAT registering either in every EU member state, or this facilitation where you VAT register in one member state and deal with your VAT accounting through that for the rest of the EU. It's this thing called the mini one-stop shop, which is supposed to make life easier. But again, it really comes back to what are you doing? How are you supplying it? What's the content? Is it delivered live or is it delivered on demand? So in principle, there can be VAT issues to consider, but fundamentally, it's what are you doing will drive that. So this thing, mini one-stop shop, MOS, may be something to consider in that particular situation.
Thank you, Phil. That's really useful. Really useful. One final question that may assist a few attendees on this call. What do rules of origin mean for very small businesses using the standard Royal Mail postal system for sending goods to customers in the EU that are of low value?
Okay, I'm not going to answer the question in relation to declarations, which Phil might answer, but it's worth knowing that the EU has different rules to the UK for low value shipments. The EU is imposing if you like, allowing a waiver for certain goods under 500 euros in the case of products sent in small packages, or 1,200 euros if it's an item forming part of a traveller's personal luggage. If something's coming to the UK from the EU, the UK's taken a different view and put £1,000 in, which actually includes commercial goods. So anything coming into the UK that's under £1,000, the UK is prepared to kind of apply a waiver on in terms of the rules of origin tests. As I say, the EU's taken a slightly different stance. You need to look up those rules to be clear, because the EU's sort of taken a slightly different view. There are different values in relation to customs declarations and VAT treatment that Phil can comment on, perhaps.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So again, Stephen, you're right. You've touched on the points about requirement for point of origin. People may have read stories on the BBC and other outlets where it said, people have had an unexpected VAT bill when they've ordered something online, received it, and then suddenly been landed with a duty and VAT bill. and this is a consequence of one of the consequences. It's to do with the removal of something called low value consignment relief, but essentially for goods valued at below £135, there are a set of rules determining who accounts for the VAT, whether that's the seller, the online marketplace, or actually the individual receiving the goods. It comes down to a number of things. Where are the goods located, when they're being sold, and who has responsibility for importing. But there are a set of rules that says it's the responsibility for the seller, be that an overseas seller or an online marketplace, that they charge VAT at the point of sale. But there will be situations potentially where, you know, a person receiving something will have before they can actually take ownership of it, they may need to go to the post office or whatever and actually pay the VAT and the customs duty before they can actually have it. Again, it depends on the specific circumstances, and this is something that's been around for, you know, receiving low value consignments from non-EU countries. It's just applying now, and there should be some kind of equivalence for sending things back into the EU. So it depends, but really it's anything less than £135, you know, may land you with an additional VAT bill.
Thank you so much, Phil. Right, just conscious of time, so I will let everybody go, but I just want to take this opportunity to thank our panellists very much. So Stephen, David and Phil for taking part in this panel. I hope that that's helped. We will continue to keep communication open on any all the changes and try and keep you up to date. I will share a recording of this session, so please feel free to watch it back or share it with any colleagues that may find it useful. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you again to our wonderful panel.
All right, Bex, before you go, could I just finally add, we're happy in government and DFE, and you've obviously got our details and we can put some links out. We're happy to take away any feedback, any issues after the event and help research them. Equally, our government customs team are equally happy to get involved. Unfortunately, they couldn't be with us today, but more than happy to take away any issues arising.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. That's much appreciated. I'll share all your details in the follow-up later this afternoon. Thank you, everybody.